For several weeks before Lent and after Easter, Reverend Bob and I have been looking at passages where individuals have an encounter with Jesus. Each time we saw that an authentic encounter with Jesus did not leave that person the same, but transformed them. This transformation happened then, and it can happen now. And that is our prayer, that this morning you will meet with the living Christ, and that meeting will change you from the inside out, making you more and more like Jesus. Think about a relationship you're in. In any true dynamic relationship, there's going to be change in you and change in the other. But this may not be true if the relationship is a means to an end and not the end itself. What do I mean? In this passage, we see two people who have an encounter with Jesus. One person is changed and the other is not. Why? Why did the woman's encounter with Jesus change her, but Judas's encounter with Jesus didn't change him? What's the difference? We're going to look at these two stories and see how for Judas, his relationship with Jesus was a means to an end. He uses his relationship with Jesus. But for this unknown woman, her relationship with Jesus was just for Jesus. This morning's reading is like a sandwich. There are two stories. The first story is in verses 1 and 2 and concludes in verses 10 and 11. And then the second story is in the middle, verses 3 to 9, the story about the woman and a bottle of perfume. One story is about a problem the chief priests and the teachers are faced with. They want to have Jesus arrested and killed. But the problem is that its Passover is going to take place in about 2 days. And during the Passover festival, the population of Jerusalem swells about 4 or 5 times the normal size because all the people have come over to make their pilgrimage and to celebrate. And so the chief priests and the teachers of the law couldn't do very much without a riot on their hand. Remember, the people had welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, throwing palm branches and singing Hosanna. So they ask, how can we get Jesus without causing a riot, an uproar? How do we get rid of him and do it secretly? And they find a solution, and we read about it in verses 10 and 11, which says, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. If you're like me, you've read and heard that passage so many times that you don't really stop to think. But if you do, when you do that, you realize what an incredibly heartbreaking and appalling and horrible act Judas is about to do. Verse 10 tells us very explicitly that Judas was one of the 12. Judas has had an intimate, unrestricted, privileged access to Jesus. He lived among the disciples and Jesus for 3 years. He was their friend. And yet Judas decides he's going to sell Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. At that time, 30 pieces of silver was the minimum price to pay for a slave. And here is Judas exchanging Jesus for the minimum possible price for a slave. In a way, Judas is saying that Jesus' entire life was worth the lowest possible price, the price of a slave. This is a horrible, unforgivable, and heartbreaking act. And yet what we see in Judas is something we see in every single one of us. And that is the tendency to view the entire world as a means to our own ends. There's a tendency for us to view the world with a cost-benefit analysis. We're a calculating people. We're always calculating to see what our gain will be whether it's in relationship, whether it's in work, or whether it's in faith. There's a tendency for us to view things in terms of benefit to us. And we see in Judas the danger and ultimately the destruction that this can bring. If you're constantly calculating, how can I benefit from my work, from my relationship? If I'm trying to determine always to benefit, find the benefit around me, it can destroy you and the world. There is a title of a magazine called Can't Get No Satisfaction. And the subtitle of that article is this: in a culture where work can be a religion, burnout is a crisis of faith. It's a very interesting article, and I'd be willing to hand copies to others. The article is about the experience of burnout. It says burnout is like being a dry teapot over a high flame, or being a drained battery that can no longer hold its charge. It causes emotional fatigue, sometimes it causes physical illness, and often it causes relationship alienation and separation from people who love you and people you love. The author says that those who are prone to burnout are high-octane individuals and professionals like bankers and lawyers and surgeons. It also said that those in caring professions like social work, teachers, nurses, clergy also experience high rates of burnout. What the author discovered was that burnout was not simply a function of working long hours. It wasn't a function of stressful working condition. What the research suggests was that burnout happened regardless of the industry, regardless of the number of hours worked. Burnout happens when expectations exceed reality. Burnout happens when expectation for money, for power, for affirmation, for recognition, or whatever is not met. When what you expect and you feel you're entitled to is more than what you actually get, that's when you experience burnout. In the article, the author interviewed a therapist for lawyers and bankers and asked why his clients were burning out. And he says this, that his clients are not different from any other workers, even public school teachers and nurses and so forth. The reason they're burnout is because there's a huge gap between what they expect from their jobs and what they got. The therapist said this: I can't tell you how many people come into my office and ask, how come I have all this money and I can't find happiness? And he tells them that happiness equals reality divided by expectations. Burnout happens when we expect work is to be more than what we should. It happens when we expect inappropriate returns. Now, although the therapist wouldn't say this, burnout happens when we expect our ultimate joy, our ultimate happiness, our ultimate sense of self and self-affirmation, when our ultimate sense is looked for in other things. If you love your work for control, for power, for prestige, for affirmation to who you are, instead of what it actually provides, and that is a service to people, to use your skills and talents productively to serve others, then you will experience burnout. It is not only with work that we are calculating and considering, how do I benefit? We do that with relationships as well. There's another article which I really enjoyed reading. It says, What Shamu Taught Me About Happy Marriages. There's even a book about it if anybody's looking for a wedding gift. It was an article about a school for training exotic animals like hyenas and baboons and killer whales. And it occurred to the author as she was concluding the research that all the techniques that she saw and learned from training exotic animals to get them to do whatever the trainer wanted, all these techniques for training animals could actually work on the husband. She wanted to get her husband to do whatever she wanted. And she basically used these techniques to help him unlearn old tricks and learn new tricks. Let me quote a little piece here. I listened rapt as professional trainers explained how they taught dolphins to flip and elephants to paint. Eventually, it hit me that the same technique might work on that stubborn but lovable species, the American husband. The central lesson I learned from exotic animal trainer is that I should reward behavior I like and ignore behaviors I don't. After all, you don't get a sea lion to balance a ball at the end of its nose by nagging. The same goes for the American husband. I love it. Okay, this was just a humorous article, but it was the most emailed article for weeks and weeks. What does that tell you? That wives are desperate for help, right? And I'm in for a rude awakening. But imagine if you ask your wife of 20 years, why do you love me? Why is it that you married me? What would you say if your spouse told you, I married you because I knew I could train you to do whatever I wanted? If you heard this, you would be outraged. You would be totally shocked. You would feel like a trained animal. The point is, I'm trying to make, and probably not too well, is that relationships can also become a means to an end. And all of us at some level are guilty of this because we ask, perhaps not out loud, but we ask, what am I getting out of this relationship? What's the maximum return I can get for minimum investment? And this is what Judas is doing. He's calculating the worth of Jesus Christ simply in his usefulness, simply in what benefits him. What benefit can Jesus provide him? And this is true for all of us, regretfully. There's a tendency, whether it's in relationship or work or even our faith, to evaluate everything on a cost-benefit analysis. What's my benefit? What's in it for me? God, I'll give you my life if it goes the way I want it. God, I'll believe you if I stay healthy, if you deliver on my plans, on my schedule. As long as I can live my life based on what I define as beneficial and useful to me, then I'll believe you. You know what the Bible calls this? The Bible calls this sin. And just like Judas, it has the power to destroy our lives.